This podcast is brought to you by North Carolina's electric cooperatives.
This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome. You've heard and read the spin the media and the politicians have put on the issues of the day. To get the correct spin on what's going on in North Carolina, let's introduce you to our panel of experts. They include John Hood, Syndicated Columnist and author, former Representative and former Senator Leo Daughtry, former State Senator and former Chair of the Board of Education. This is taking longer for the introductions in this show. Howard Lee, and Chris Fitzsimon, who's currently the leader of NC Policy Watch. Well, on this 992nd edition of NC Spin, we ask our panel to discuss the appointment of a special master in the legislative redistricting case. We'll explore the impact of Congress's tax reform proposals on the people in our state, and we'll revisit the issue of exempt state employees and how many is the right number. Plus, as always, we ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. Let's get to it. 3 federal judges hearing the legislative redistricting case concluded that 9 districts either failed to potentially remedy the identified constitutional violation or are otherwise legally unacceptable. The judges then appointed a Stanford University professor as a special master to review the districts, and if the professor does not feel the 9 comply, he's authorized to submit his own maps. Question 1 to Leo Daughtry. Let's make sure we understand what the judges said and what is known in the Covington case. They're dealing specifically with racial gerrymandering, not political gerrymandering. Is that correct?
That's my understanding. You have 2 cases. One is called Covington and one is called Harris. Harris has to do with the congressional redistricting case, and in that case they talked about partisan problems. So those 2 cases somehow melded together, but the Covington case was just about racial gerrymandering.
Howard, the appointment of this special master came after the 3-judge panel asked each side in this case to come up with a list of names of 3 people that they could concur agree with, to be a special master. They couldn't do it. And right. as a result, the panel decided, to heck with this, we'll do it ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think it's unfortunate that the folk who at the table couldn't take advantage of that opportunity to at least come together on choosing a person to take a look at these districts. And I think in some ways it's going to probably take it so far out of their hands that they're going to have to accept what they get. I was getting ready to say, they've lost total control, haven't they, John? I mean, because this guy personally that they've hired as a master, who has experience, by the way, in other states.
Yeah, well, he's a special master. I think that the Republicans were complaining that there wasn't an ordinary master, that they wouldn't want a special one, I guess. I think part of the confusion here is that the court has said the plan violates the previously established standards, apparently established about 30 minutes ago or something. So they violated the standards. They won't say exactly how yet. So they've got the special master on the job, but they haven't really explained why the special master's on the job. I think you can guess. And I think their argument from the judge's point of view will be, we have to act quickly. We have to get this person in place, drawing up the maps by the 1st of December or early December, in which case that give the plaintiffs and the defendants time to look at the maps, and they're going to have a hearing in January because candidate filing starts in February. That's the sense of timing here, I think, but Republicans feel like the judges already know what they want.
Well, at midweek, we had an interesting development in this, Chris, from the standpoint that the Republicans objected to the appointment of this special master, and the judges came back and said, hey, look, you're not entitled to multiple opportunities to remedy unconstitutional districts.
Well, that's right, and the special master will be redrawing some of these districts. And remember, this, I think people generally expected that the courts would give the General Assembly one more chance. They let the General Assembly draw the maps again. They found that some of these districts were still unconstitutional, partially because of race. They also struck down some because they thought the General Assembly changed too many districts. They went out of their way to change some. So now the special master is going to draw them. And, you know, it's worth remembering, we've already had one election. These districts were found unconstitutional before the 2016 election. So we've already had one election. That's why I think there's also a sense of urgency on the court. We don't want to drag this well into 2018 because we've already elected one General Assembly with maps that were flawed. We need to make sure we have correct constitutional maps in place for the next election.
But Leo, don't you find it somewhat interesting that the panel of judges has never just outright said these districts, these 9 districts are unconstitutional?
I do. I find it very unusual. And I think really if you looked at the underlying feeling is they just don't like the fact that the Republicans are drawing these districts, and they are doing so to take advantage of a partisan slate of candidates.
Well, except there's one Republican judge on this, it's been a unanimous ruling, so I don't think the judges are making all partisan decisions here.
Howard, the districts that they're looking at are Senate District 21 in Hope County, 28 in Guilford County, House Districts 21 in Sampson and Wayne counties, 36, 37, 40, and 41 in Wake County, 57 in Guilford County, and 105 in Mecklenburg County. Do these districts have anything in common, or were they just pulled out of the hat because the racial parity is not right?
Well, I think it's based pretty much on the racial parity concept that they're looking at. I don't know those districts that well, but I would tend to think that the judges are really concerned about the packing process. And of course, you don't need to create standards if your eyes can tell you that things have been done. Yeah.
All right. So John, the situation is that the 3-judge panel have given this master until December 1st to draw these new districts, or sooner if he can get them done by then. What happens then?
Well, as I said, the plaintiffs and the challenger, or the plaintiffs and the defendants, will presumably take a look at the maps. They will make whatever arguments they want to make, presumably the defendants in this case, if they have an objection to the maps. Then there'll be apparently a hearing in January in front of the court. I assume that the court's intention, unless there is a serious objection brought up, would be then to order that these maps be used for filing, which begins in February.
Could there be a further lawsuit challenging the judge's ruling?
I think there'll probably be an attempt. I'm not exactly sure what recourse the defendants have, but they would like to get this back in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. Remember, their entire approach to this second time around was to say they didn't use race at all in the drawing, so that Clarence Thomas, which is the only reason these maps were struck down, is because Clarence Thomas, who usually votes with the more conservative judges, voted with the more liberal judges. That's the only reason. And they're trying to convince him to come back around and say, well, we didn't use race. You said we shouldn't use race at all. Lift this order from this 3-judge panel. That's their plan. I just don't know if they can make it happen.
Chris, there's some real timeliness here. I mean, December 1 may sound like he's on sort of a short fuse to draw these districts. But the filing for the primaries is supposed to begin in February of 2018, and there's still incumbents who might be affected by these new maps.
Well, and not only that, there are people who might be considering running for the General Assembly and think they live in a district in Charlotte or Greensboro or Raleigh or somewhere else in Wake County and want to run. They might find out, they don't know whether they're in the district or not, and they're able to run. So there is a huge timing. And remember, we have already had one election under these unconstitutional districts. The court, I think, is adamant that that not happen again, and that we follow the traditional process and let voters make choices, let candidates know in time. That's what's really driving this, I think.
Really quickly, around the horn, let me ask the question. Are we moving into an era when the courts are going to increasingly be doing, you reminded us before we started taping about Knox Jenkins from your county, Johnston County,
That's
that
correct.
drew those districts back at shortly after the turn of the century. Are we going to see more and more judges or special masters doing redistricting?
Oh, I think we are, mainly because legislatures are not doing the job they need to do.
John?
Unless we change the process in a fundamental way, this is probably the default.
Interesting. Leo?
I would hate to say that, but I believe we are going in that direction. It's a shame that we are.
Chris?
I think we are too, but I think it adds momentum to dramatically changing the process. Let's, as much as we can, let's take this out of the hands of politicians. Let's have criteria that everybody agrees to, and let somebody else draw the maps the first time.
3 words: Independent Redistricting Commission, right? Well, you've probably heard me say that former State Treasurer Harlan Boyles was one of my mentors and a good friend to many of us here at NC Spin. Next Monday, December 13th, Treasurer Dale Falwell will hold Harlan Boyles Day at the State Treasurer's Office at 4 p.m. to recognize Harlan's posthumous induction into the National Association of State Auditors, Controllers, and Treasurers Hall of Fame. You're invited to join us in this tribute. Again, it's Monday at 4 p.m. at the State Treasurer's Office, 3200 Atlantic Avenue in Raleigh. Be sure to attend. We're going to take a break, and after we come back, we're going to talk about taxes.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
Agriculture is the backbone of our state's economy. It's the heartbeat of our rural communities. Its strength means bustling sidewalks and open signs in store windows. And with smart investments in our future, like the Plant Sciences Initiative and modern updated research stations, agriculture will remain the cornerstone of our economy. Because when agriculture is strong, our economy is strong.
For more than 45 years, the North Carolina Retired Governmental Employees Association has advocated for local and state government retirees. Whether protecting retiree benefits or fighting for cost of living adjustments, more than 70,000 members count on us to be their voice. Government retirees work for us, and we stand for them. Learn more at ncrgea.com.
We now return to NC Spin.
While we were during the break, Tim King came up to me and said, you said December 13th, not November 13th for Harlan Boyle's Day. And I said, whoops, it is November 13th. Well, aside from the news concerning the Russian investigation, the focus of this past week has been on tax reform. Longtime Congressman Russell Long from Louisiana summed up the feeling of most people about taxes when he said, don't tax you, don't tax me, tax that fella behind the tree. Howard Lee, I've heard you say this before, and we want you to talk about federal, state, and local taxes and its impact. There are a number of issues at stake in Washington's attempt at reform, but getting the most attention is the so-called SALT exemption of allowing taxpayers to deduct state and local taxes as well as deductions for home mortgage interest. How important are these exemptions to North Carolinians?
Well, from my perspective, they're very important. Of course, this is not the first time Congress has had these issues on the table for consideration. I think it would be unfortunate to eliminate, especially the mortgage deduction, because so many middle-class people, and even those of us who are retired, use that to kind of reduce the tax burden that we have. As far as state and local taxes are concerned, I think obviously it's an important deduction for people who are filing their taxes, and I'd hate to see them leave because I think it would impact North Carolina as much as any other state.
John, they were supposed to have released the details of the tax plan last Wednesday. Then we were told there are problems with it that they're trying to fix, and it was going to be later in the week before they all got the opportunity to be able to do so. I think the big question is, are there enough votes in the House to be able to pass this
Well,
thing?
this is the reason why some of these things were delayed. They're working out some deals. It's important to understand the macro story here, which is that this tax reform, and probably in any form that it shows up, is going to dramatically increase the standard deductions, like we did in North Carolina. When you dramatically increase the standard deductions, you reduce the number of people who itemize. You don't get state local tax breaks, you don't get mortgage interest deductions unless you itemize. So even if they don't touch those at all, but they just expand standard deductions, the percentage, remember that most taxpayers in North Carolina don't ever see any of these breaks because they take the standard deduction. Only about a quarter to a third take itemization. Under the federal tax bill, that might go down to 10 or 5%. These may become, frankly, fairly irrelevant. From my perspective, good. The mortgage interest deduction is one of the most destructive parts of the tax code.
This is particularly of interest, though, Chris, in these states like New York and Florida and some of these states that don't have very much in the way of income taxes, but do have sales taxes that they want to try to get.
Right. I think the state and local tax deduction is one of the big issues. The child tax credit is another big issue. What they do to IRA deductions is another big issue. And then an issue that we haven't heard much about, all of a sudden Republicans don't seem to be concerned about exploding the federal deficit. A couple years ago, that was the major issue facing America, was the national debt and the national deficit. I haven't seen many suggestions about how to offset the $1.5 to $2.5, depending on how big it is, $1 trillion increase in the federal deficit. Now they're just trying to get a political win. And I think this is correctly called a tax cut more than tax reform. The vast majority of it, it looks like, is going to go to the wealthiest folks in America. And I think if there's one thing we can agree on is that the people at the very top, the top 1%, don't need more help. That's not what's going on in America. Those aren't the people who are struggling. That's not going to trickle down to blue-collar workers anywhere.
But, Leo, the basic premise behind this whole reform was if we cut taxes, it'll stimulate the economy, create new jobs, put money in the pockets of citizens. You were part of the legislature when North Carolina went through these reforms back in 2011. We've had a similar experience. What's been the result? Did it create more jobs? Did it stimulate the economy?
Well, clearly you can argue that because we have created more jobs and the economy's been stimulated. But talking about what Chris says about taxing the rich, if you're going to give a tax break, you got to give it to people who pay taxes. And the more you pay, the more you're going to get as a tax break. So I don't know that saying this for the rich is really, I think, somewhat disingenuous.
I think giving tax cuts to the middle class, expanding the earned income tax credit, expanding the child tax credit, I'm not sure that we need folks on Wall Street and hedge fund folks to get a big tax break.
I was watching the press conference, the White House press conference this week. Sarah Huckabee Sanders was trying to explain this, and it was very interesting. John, a Washington think tank just released results of a study reporting that North Carolina has the 11th most competitive tax code in the country. Has that benefited us?
Absolutely. We went from something like 41 or 42 on that list to 11. Now, I'm not going to argue that all the growth that's happened since 2013 in North Carolina, which has beaten the national and regional averages in most measures of economic growth since 2013. I'm not going to argue that's all because of tax reform. That would be silly. Some of it probably was helped by favorable regulatory policy and tax policy. Some of the effects of taxes and regulations, whether we're talking about the state or the federal government, if it does something this year, those effects are going to be 5 or 10 years down the road. It takes a while for the big ships to move and change course.
But Howard, getting back down to the bottom line to this whole thing and going back to Russell Long's statement, I think what most people want to know is that they're paying their fair share of taxes and no more than their fair share of taxes. Maybe even want somebody else to pay a little bit more than they do so far as a share. Is North Carolina a fair share state so far as taxation is concerned?
I tend to think it is. Certainly there are areas that can be improved and areas that I'd like to see us focus a little more attention on. But overall, I haven't been unhappy, and I'm not unhappy with North Carolina's taxing program.
Tom, I think Chris does bring up a legitimate point about the effects of the policy on the deficits. We've got to cut spending if we're going to cut taxes. I volunteer to be a special master. I'll be happy to be appointed to control the federal budget. I'll make it balance in 2 years.
I bet.
And I'll be generous because I would do it in 1 year, but I'll allow it to be done in 2. As a special master.
Hang around, folks, and let's watch that one take place.
We got to vote on that one?
Yeah, very quickly, yes or no. Is Congress going to get tax reform passed by the end of the year? John?
I think something will pass.
Leo?
Yes.
Howard?
No.
If it won't be reform, it'll be some small tax cut for some people.
All right. After the break, we're going to talk about state employees, exempt or not.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
With today's tools, all the information you need is just a click away.
I'm going to show you how to remove the...
And as a member of an electric cooperative, you have access to lots of valuable tools. Tools that help you do it yourself when it comes to controlling your home energy use and budget, leaving you free to be Dad. Discover how your electric cooperative can help you control your energy use at empowermenc.com.
I help educate and inspire visually impaired students to strive for a brighter future.
I make sure visitors to the North Carolina Zoo take a walk on the wild side.
And I make sure that the fuel you buy is a quality product from pipeline to pump.
I support small businesses in North Carolina by matching them with hard-working, well-trained employees.
I make sure the roads you drive on are safe.
Scenic, the one voice speaking in support of the men and women who are making North Carolina great.
You sleep on concrete till your body get immune to concrete.
My mom got my brother and I up and said, come on, we're leaving.
I became homeless in the beginning of this year.
When I was about 4 or 5 years old, our house caught fire.
I used to see my brother. If he see me, he'd turn and go the other direction.
We did the only thing that we could think of, and we went to a Salvation Army shelter.
You know, we don't have this, like, what's your background look like? We just say, what do you need?
I remember the man from the Salvation Army coming down with a box of clothes.
The Salvation Army officer bought my brother and I an ice cream cone.
Last week, my brother walked up to me, and he just started a conversation.
Today I've given my life to the Salvation Army because I remember what somebody did for me, my brother, and my mom over 30 years ago.
The Salvation Army for me means hope.
Compassion.
Family.
Support.
We now return to NC Spin.
You might remember that just before Roy Cooper became governor, the legislature reduced the number of people who are exempt from the State Personnel Act from 1,500 down to 425. Cooper sued, saying the legislation interfered with the separation of powers, but at least 3 of the employees Cooper fired sued the state, and a judge said they got to get their jobs back, plus back pay and attorney's fee. Chris, the number of exempt employees was around 500 in Governor Easley's and Perdue's administrations, but then lawmakers raised that number to 1,500 for Governor McCrory. How big a deal is it that they lowered it back to a more traditional level for Roy Cooper?
It's probably just a coincidence that the first 2 governors you mentioned were Democrats, and then there was a Republican governor, and then they lowered it down for a Democrat again. I'm sure that had nothing to do with it, the party. It's kind of ludicrous to suggest this was nothing but partisan politics and trying to keep Republicans in office who were appointed by Republican governors and keep the Democratic governor from appointing a bunch of folks that he wanted in office. And that's what this all comes down to. I thought it was, speaking of disingenuous, I can't think of any more the defense of this, that we need quality state employees and all these things. They weren't so concerned about it until we had a Democrat in the governor's.
Leo Daughtry, he's talking to you. You were in that legislature when all of this was going on. Why were you willing to increase the number of exempt employees to 1,500?
I'm trying to remember how many Governor Martin had. I don't remember exactly.
He didn't have 1,500.
He didn't have 1,500.
He didn't have 400, did he?
I don't think it was changed dramatically.
I don't know. But what I'm saying, I agree that 1,400 is too many. And the governor ought to have the opportunity to bring his people in that's loyal to him, that he can count on. But to bring in 1,500 is too many. I think 400 to 500 is about right.
I may be mistaken about this, but I don't think Governor McCrory used all of them.
He used the vast majority. No, he used the vast majority. More than 1,300.
He had more than 1,300.
Well, it must have taken him a while. He didn't do it quickly.
Right.
Howard, if you remember, we talked about this back in December and early January when the legislature passed this. And the majority of our panelists, or most of our panelists that we talked with about it, we're not all that upset with the number of 400 or 500, the process they weren't happy about. Do you still feel this is a reasonable number?
I do think it's a reasonable number, but at the same time, what happens is Governor Cooper now is stuck with a lot of folk he can't get rid of because they were brought in under that high number. And
but hasn't that been the case with other?
It has been to some extent, but I think it would be fair for the legislature and the governor to sit down and come up with an exact number that the governor needs to get his job done, and then leave it alone, for goodness sakes.
Leo, so far as these 3 people are concerned, they sued the state. The panel said that they're going to get their jobs back pay, attorney's fees, and so forth like that. Governor Cooper's appealing this. Has he got any grounds here?
I don't think so. I think that they have a case that they were there and they were working, and they were fired. I suppose they were fired or dismissed because of their political affiliation.
Well, they were dismissed because they weren't smart enough to do what the Secretary of Environmental Management did, and that is to put himself in the organization.
Demote himself and move to another.
Yeah.
Oh, man. We're going to take a break. After these messages, we're going to ask the panel to tell us something we don't know.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
The healthcare landscape is filled with questions and uncertainties of changes that are coming. In these times of change, there's one thing you can trust. You can trust your family physician to work for you, not only in treating sickness and disease, but also your overall health. Regardless of how healthcare might change, the men and women of the North Carolina Academy of Family Physicians pledge to work upholding your trust. Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisors.
I help educate and inspire visually impaired students to strive for a brighter future.
I make sure visitors to the North Carolina Zoo take a walk on the wild side.
And I make sure that the fuel you buy is a quality product from pipeline to pump.
I support small businesses in North Carolina by matching them with hard-working, well-trained employees.
I make sure the roads you drive on are safe.
Scenic, the one voice speaking in support of the men and women who are making North Carolina great.
We now return to NC Spin.
Now we come to one of the more enjoyable parts of our show, which is totally unrehearsed, when we ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. Howard Lee, I'm going to start with you.
I've had the privilege for the last few years of working closely with former Governor Jim Hunt as relates to his institute, and the focus has been to identify rising leaders, both nonpartisan basis, and help them develop a clear understanding about how to develop education policy. We've had tremendous success, and we were reviewing it last week, and we now have a number of governors who are now in place, and I think they're going to be really, really outstanding leaders.
Now, these are policies not only for North Carolina, but throughout the entire nation.
These are policies for throughout the entire nation.
Interesting. Very good. Chris, Fitzsimon, tell us something we don't know.
Well, you've probably heard that President Trump decided not to continue cost-sharing payments under the Affordable Care Act, and what you probably haven't heard enough of, although it's getting a little publicity, the enrollment period for the Affordable Care Act is now underway. Traditionally, it's been the first 4 years, it has been 3 months. President Trump and his administration have shortened it to 45 days. They have cut the outreach budget to publicize the enrollment period by 90%. They announced that budget cut in August. So I think it's almost scandalous. You can disagree with the Affordable Care Act. If you want to repeal it, you want to amend it in Congress. What we're having now is sabotage of the Affordable Care Act. Imagine if we were doing that to Medicare or any other program. If it's the law of the land, people ought to get to know about it. They ought to have the same time to sign up, and we shouldn't be trying to keep health care away from people just because we don't like the law.
So you're saying people ought to actually know about this enrollment period?
Well, I would think that they've also cut money for people to help people sign up. It's really outrageous.
John Hood, tell us something we don't know.
Well, as you know, I'm just nerdy enough to study monthly employment numbers for North Carolina and other states, and I noticed as of September that North Carolina's employment to population ratio, which was problematic for many years, is now at a pretty healthy area, at least for the region of the southeastern states, the 12 southeastern states. Only Virginia and Georgia, and only Georgia very slightly, exceed North Carolina in the number of people we have employed divided by the relevant population. So it's another good example of North Carolina's economy really hitting on many, many cylinders. Maybe not all of them, but almost all of them.
Leo Daughtry, tell us something we don't know.
In my former district, we have a company called Novo Nordisk that is spending $1 billion expanding. And one of the reasons they're expanding is because diabetes in North Carolina, as well as the country, is epidemic. And they are working diligently to create a pill rather than a shot. And I'm hopeful that that can happen very soon.
All right. We've got about 30 seconds left. Municipal elections taking place next week. Are we going to see any surprises very quickly, John?
Watch that Charlotte mayor's race. I'm told it is closer than people would have expected.
Chris?
I think the Raleigh's mayor's race might be a little closer than we think.
Any others y'all can think of? Some of the other races?
Fayetteville mayor's race also.
That's a really interesting
will
one.
be a competitive race.
I think Charlotte is probably the most interesting right now.
Charlotte and Raleigh for sure. Well, we'll be talking about them for sure on next week's show. Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, give your feedback, and read my weekly column, be sure to visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. And join us next week when we'll have more balanced debate for the Old North State. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.